Welcome, everyone, to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, OLLI at Berkeley. I am Susan Hoffman, the director, and I am delighted to be joined today by Michael Omi and Donald Tamaki. Each term, OLLI offers a talk on racial justice issues. We call the series America's Unfinished Work. Our campus co-sponsor for today's talk is the Asian American Research Center, whose founder, Michael Omi, will introduce our speaker, Donald Tamaki. The talk will be recorded, captioned, and sent to all who registered. And for today, as we finish the presentation, please post your questions and comments in the chat, and we will take as many questions as we can. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Michael Omi. You're next.
Thank you, Susan. And let me welcome you all. I'm delighted you can join us today for what is a very timely and relevant talk by Attorney Don Tamaki. In 1989, Democratic Representative John Conyers of Michigan introduced a bill calling for the creation of a commission that would study and develop proposals for Black reparations. It went nowhere. Conyers went on to introduce the bill in every session of Congress for nearly 3 decades until he retired in 2017. Following the protests in 2020 over George Floyd's murder, a growing number of cities, counties, and states have now taken up the issue of Black reparations. Just a week ago, the New York City Council passed legislation authorizing a commission to, quote, acknowledge, study, and address the legacy and impact of slavery and racial injustices in New York City, end of quote. Attempts such as these have really faced fierce political opposition. In a climate of intense hostility towards critical race theory, DEI efforts, and affirmative action, support for Black reparations have been strongly contested by not only those on the far right, but also political moderates and liberals. This is, in fact, an important moment to consider the arguments and the narrative strategies that critics of reparations have advanced, and to consider how we might flip the script and provide a counter-narrative to the arguments against Black reparations. It's truly a pleasure, and I sincerely mean that, to introduce Don Tamaki, who was appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom to serve on the 9-member California Black Reparations Task Force. Don and I were undergraduates here at Berkeley, and I remember being impressed, even back then, at Don's unwavering commitment to social justice issues. In the 1980s, Don participated in the Japanese American reparations movement and served on the pro bono legal team that reopened the landmark 1944 Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu, vacating his criminal conviction for defying the order that led to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. Don is a senior counsel at Donald Tamaki, LLP, and currently serves in the core leadership of the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth, ART, a statewide campaign advancing systemic change and making the case that Black reparations is about justice long overdue. Don will speak, and then, as Susan said, we'll have some time for questions and comments that you could submit through the chat feature in Zoom. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Attorney Don Tamaki.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Susan. I've known Susan for many years, who's spent a career and a lifetime shining a light on important issues. And Michael Omi, Professor Michael Omi, we're about the same age, but he's my mentor, especially on matters of race and racial justice. Obviously, what could be more difficult conversation to have than race in America? We only have to look to today's headlines about the president, the former president, accusing immigrant Haitians legally here from, eating people's neighbors' pets and the impact that that has had on that community, terrifying that community. State troopers are protecting schools and government buildings, and Proud Boys are marching in the streets, and Ku Klux Klan is distributing leaflets. So to all who are attending this webinar, while I hope I can offer something interesting, please know that it is relevant, unfortunately relevant, regrettably so, because it has to do with America's racial pathology. And that pathology didn't start in this election cycle, didn't start 10 years ago, 50 years ago. It has an origin, and that origin is 1619. The values that were used to prop up the institution of slavery for 2.5 centuries, and which has continued in one form or another through the decades to follow. America's racial pathology has harmed a lot of people, but my focus will be on Black reparations and analyzing the 5 most common arguments against reparations and the rejoinders for each. So let's get started. Mr. Floyd was murdered on May 25th, 2020, triggering the largest protests in U.S. history, calling for a racial reckoning. 4 months later, the state of California approved Shirley Weber's AB 3121, creating the task force to study and develop reparations proposals. The purpose of the task force was to, 1, document the harm over the last 400 years, 2, recommend ways to educate the public of our findings, and 3, develop reparations proposals. So the 9-member task force was created, 5 members appointed by the governor, and 4 members appointed by the legislature. On June 29, 2023, after 2 years of work, 27 days of hearings, and 48 hours of testimony from expert and lay witnesses, we presented a groundbreaking 1,100-page final report drawing a through line from 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow exclusion and racial terror, and decades more of continuing discrimination, resulting in today's outcomes, for which we made over 115 recommendations for repair. Certainly the question is, why is California leading the nation on this issue? Let me recite some history. The Civil War ended in 1865, but about 5 minutes after Robert E. Lee surrendered. The South was determined to reinstate laws and ways as close to slavery as possible. And no wonder, for 246 years, one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world had been built. The U.S. enslaved population was almost 4 million, and cotton was the economic engine that powered the entire country. Every sector of white society benefited from, participated in, or was complicit with slavery, including almost every major Christian denomination, colleges and universities, plantation owners in the South, and industrialist banks, insurance companies, and big and small businesses in the North. The nation's constitution protected slavery and gave Southern states outsized political power. Half of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers while in office. More than 1,800 congressmen representing 37 states once enslaved Black people. At the end of the Civil War, Congress seized land from wealthy Southerners, intending to distribute 40 acres to each formerly enslaved person to establish the means of self-sufficiency. In January of 1865, 400,000 acres from South Carolina to Florida along its coastal shores were deeded to 40,000 formerly enslaved who settled on and worked the land. But by April of 1865, a mere 4 months later, Lincoln was assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, declaring, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Johnson rescinded the land reparations program and ordered the Black settlers to leave their land. Land reparations was scrapped to assure peace among the states, but at an incalculable long-term cost to formerly enslaved people. During that 12-year period post-Civil War, known as Reconstruction, Congress tried to give newly freed Black Americans access to basic civil rights like the right to vote. But white Northern support for Reconstruction collapsed, and to resolve the contested presidential election of 1876, Republicans and Democrats cut a deal to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. States, including California, passed literacy tests, poll taxes, and created other devices to prevent Black Americans from voting. In 1867, Black turnout was 90% in Virginia. After Virginia's voter suppression laws, Black voters dropped from 147,000 to just 21,000. These restrictions secured the power of white politicians, allowing them to block hundreds of civil rights laws, and well into the 20th century, excluding Black Americans from the country's most important rights, such as Social Security and labor law protections. And racial terror followed. The slide depicts the front page of the New Orleans State's newspaper, June 26, 1919, blaring the headline, 3,000 will burn Negro, with subheadline, John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 p.m. this afternoon. While lynching is often portrayed as torture murders perpetrated by a few, many were highly advertised public events attended by thousands as a means of enforcing and normalizing the social order. There were more than 6,500 lynchings nationwide between 1865 and 1955, and that is most assuredly an undercount since many were not documented. We think of California as being an enlightened state, but while California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state, it was plenty complicit with enslavers entering California and bringing their human property with them. This slide depicts 1850's announcement of, quote, Negro for sale. On Saturday, June 26, I will sell at public auction a Negro man. Historians estimate that there were upwards of 1,500 enslaved people brought into California during the gold rush of 1849. California anti-state constitution meant little because it was not a crime to keep someone enslaved. Here's an 1852 San Francisco Herald newspaper ad offering $100 reward for recapture of a runaway from Mrs. Elizabeth Ware of a Black girl named Hagar to be delivered to the hands of the sheriff in San Francisco. From 1852 to 1855, the legislature passed fugitive slave laws, allowing persons escaping enslavement to be chased down and sent back to the South, even though they had been living in the free state of California. In 1850, California banned Black people from testifying against white people in court, including in fugitive slave law cases. 2 years later, the California Supreme Court likewise barred Chinese testimony against white people. The result? White people could commit crimes against Black and Chinese people with impunity. And much of Jim Crow found its way into California. Democrats rose to power in 1867 by vowing to fight against any new law that would make Black, Indigenous, or Chinese people equal to white people. At that time, there were few Black people in the state, so hate groups mainly terrorized Chinese communities, and the law did not protect them. Between 1850 and 1935, 352 lynchings took place, including of 8 Black Californians, but mostly persons of Chinese, Indigenous, and Mexican descent. White supremacy groups flourished in the West. By the 1920s, California became known as a strong Klan state, with sizable chapters emerging in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose. During much of the 20th century, federal, state, and local officials, working with private individuals, actively segregated America. When you compare the redlining maps of the 1930s through the 1970s, created by lenders to exclude Black Americans from accessing federally insured loans, and this one is a map of Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, and you compare these maps with today's pre-gentrification maps of the most ultra-segregated, the most impoverished, the most underserved, the most polluted neighborhoods, they align exactly. The discrimination of the not-so-distant past, in fact, created our present. The Federal Housing Administration and other agencies help millions of mostly white Americans buy houses, creating America's middle class, while refusing the same opportunities to Black Americans. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in home loans, 98% of which went to white people, white borrowers, just one of a number of huge transfers of wealth to white Americans. California was a leader in racial exclusionary policies. By 1940, 80% of the homes in Los Angeles contained racially restrictive deed covenants barring Black families. And when Black families moved into white neighborhoods, resistance followed. This 1952 photo depicts LA neighbors William Bailey and Roger Duncan amidst the rubble of Bailey's bombed-out living room. Duncan's home was also bombed. City officials zoned Black neighborhoods as commercial or industrial, regardless of their residential character, thereby enabling polluting industries to locate there, lowering Black American property values while enhancing the value of white neighborhoods. The construction of freeways, subways, polluting industries, commercial and residential developments, and parks, all of which vastly increased productivity and wealth for entire regions, were often routed through Black neighborhoods, destroying homes and businesses using the legal tool called eminent domain, enabling government to expropriate property for a price dictated by government. This slide depicts the destruction of Black-owned homes and businesses in Oakland to make way for I-980, bisecting the city and walling off Black West Oakland. When studied in 2007, between 1949 and 1973, there were 2,532 eminent domain projects in 992 cities nationwide, resulting in 1 million people being displaced, 2/3 of whom were Black. In 1956, so-called urban renewal policies enabled San Francisco to condemn and tear down the Fillmore district, resulting in 20,000 Black San Franciscans being displaced and 883 businesses destroyed. 10 years later, the city would likewise condemn and raze Japantown, reducing it from 44 blocks to just 4. So on June 31, 2024, 12 legislators of the California Legislative Black Caucus introduced 14 reparative bills in education, in civil rights, in criminal justice reform, healthcare, and business. As we speak today, this is September of 2024, 10 of them are now sitting on the governor's desk, awaiting signature or veto. And advocates view this as at least a first step in an approach spanning years, in good economies and in bad, to address harm literally centuries in the making. But the backlash has been swift. Right-wing pundits immediately condemned, ridiculed, and were dismissive of reparations. As we remember the image of Confederate flag-toting insurrectionists smashing their way into the Capitol, longing for a racialized order that should have ended with the Civil War, we realize the values of 1619 that propped up the institution of slavery still impact the nation today. Reparations critics pandered to this backlash, stoking economic anxieties, fears of unfairness, fears that money, opportunities, and rights will be taken away from one group and redistributed as a windfall to the undeserving. What are the goals of critics in opposing reparations? There are three: to establish the rhetorical architecture of the opposition, to stymie any political momentum, and to scuttle reparations proposals. Why am I back? Thank you. Sorry about that. Law professor Eric Yamamoto helped design this presentation to identify the most common opposition arguments, parse out the rhetoric used by opponents, provide historical context, and offer reasoned responses. The five most typical criticisms of reparations are: 1, reparations are too late. The "it's too late" argument portrays reparations as only about slavery, and therefore a bygone era and too late to do anything about. The second argument are reparations are unwarranted. The "it's unwarranted" argument proclaims there is no reason for reparations, such as California was not a slave state, and that reparations is a handout for the undeserving. The third argument is reparations is too much. The too much argument casts reparations as only individual compensation and therefore unaffordable, preposterous, and fringy. The fourth argument is: what about other groups who experience discrimination? The what about argument says that it is unfair to single out Black people for reparations when others have suffered too. And the fifth argument is: it's not my fault. The not my fault argument says that today's taxpayers were not enslavers and should not be made to pay for the harms perpetrated by long dead individuals. We will dissect a Wall Street Journal editorial opinion of April 23rd, 2024, which contains in one hit piece all five objections. The "it's too late" criticisms assumes reparations is for slavery, which ended long ago, and for which it is too late to do anything about. The rejoinder to "it's too late" is what began as the harm of slavery morphed during the next 150 years thereafter into its badges and incidents, its lingering effects, too sprawling here to mention, but resulting in continuing cascading and compounding consequences today. For example, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. The exclusion from equal education, employment, the New Deal, federally insured home loans, and other opportunities have resulted in white households having 9 times more assets than Black households, Black people having shorter life expectancies by more than 7 years. In San Francisco, as just an example, for the 10-year period ending in 2021, the Black infant mortality rate was 5 times that of white infants, and huge disparities persist in housing, in income, in employment, healthcare, and rates of incarceration, among many other life metrics. Turning to the reparations are unwarranted criticism. This argument declares that past injustice has nothing to do with the racial disparities that persist today. Society is colorblind. Other groups have overcome discrimination, so Black people should just try harder. Senator Tim Scott says, "I am living proof that America is the land of opportunity and not the land of oppression." This slide captures some of the data that we've already covered about how enormously profitable racial exclusion has been in the 20th century. Government policies shunted Black Americans into redlined neighborhoods, provided white Americans with access to cheap loans, ushering them into the middle class while denying the same opportunity to Black Americans, left Black neighborhoods bereft of resources, burdened those neighborhoods by zoning them for polluting industries, freeways, and liquor stores, and designated such neighborhoods as blighted to pave the way for Black-owned property to be expropriated in order to create wealth for others. And despite instances of individual Black success, huge group disparities persist. Turning to the criticism that reparations are too much, critics dismissively declare it's all about the money and reparations is just a windfall for people who were never enslaved. AB 3121 required us to determine methodologies for calculating the economic harm done to Black Californians as a result of the state's racist policies. That was written into the statutes that we were required to make these economic calculations. So we retained 4 economics professors to calculate the economic losses suffered by Black Californians resulting from discrimination in such areas as healthcare, housing, and unjust property takings. This was a first not only in California, but anywhere in the nation. No doubt the process of shining a light on the extent of economic damages has triggered sticker shock because the losses resulting from state-sanctioned racial harms are enormous. For example, if you just take one neighborhood, say the Fillmore District in San Francisco that I mentioned, wherein 20,000 Black residents lost their homes, many never to become homeowners again, and almost 900 Black businesses were destroyed under the guise of urban renewal, which writer James Baldwin described as Negro removal. The economic losses from that singular racially motivated property seizure easily soar into the billions of dollars. But while the task force economists estimated the actual damages for California's role in the harm, and that they are in the billions of dollars, and they broke that amount down per individual, the task force did not recommend that the state should pay that amount. Moreover, none of our recommendations prioritize one form of repair over another. We never said, for example, that individual compensation is more important than, for example, reducing Black infant mortality. Instead, the task force has called upon the legislature to develop a feasible approach spanning years. As I said, in good economies, in bad, because our state budget will expand and contract historically, to analyze the 115 plus recommendations and begin to legislatively address harms that have been in the making for more than a century. Nevertheless, opponents mischaracterize task force work as a singular call for individual payments, fueling the clickbait sensationalism that drives news media revenues. Despite the noise, you should know that yes, the task force economists calculated actual damages of the harm and recommended generally that the legislature consider individual compensation, but without specifying an amount that should be paid. But the overwhelming majority of recommendations call for reforms in healthcare, in housing, education, employment, criminal justice, and many other areas. To those who would say that reparations are too much, it is also fair to ask, what is the cost to everyone of doing nothing? America just went through a COVID nightmare. The cost of PPP equipment, hospitalizations, the cost of developing and deploying vaccines, all of that cost was enormous. But what would have been the cost in lives lost, in a destroyed economy, to society as we know it, if those costs were not incurred? Yes, the cost to repair the harms of slavery and its lingering effects in various forms is expensive, but the societal cost of ignoring these issues is astronomical, whether measured in the cost of chronic disease and shortened lives, in houselessness, in public safety, lost productivity, lost talent, intractable poverty, mass incarceration. Recall the 1970s bumper sticker that teachers put on their cars to remind the public how important it is to financially support public schools. It read, "If you think education is expensive, try ignorance." Indeed. Turning to the criticism of, "It's not my fault, I was not an enslaver, why should I pay?" The answer to, "It's not my fault," is that state-sanctioned harms require state-sanctioned repair. State-sanctioned harms, as opposed to individual acts of wrongdoing, are societal debts for which we share a collective responsibility. And by the way, we pay for societal debts all the time, whether or not we personally did anything to cause those debts to be incurred. Like the war in Afghanistan that cost taxpayers $300 million a day for 20 years. We collectively pay for societal debts arising from human-caused wrongs or from natural disasters. I'm not an executive in big oil, but I'm pretty sure that my tax dollars will be paying for the harm caused by the burning of fossil fuel. Scholars Linda Bilmes and Cornell Brooks argue that reparative programs to address categories of people harmed through no fault of their own are both commonplace and huge cumulatively in the billions and billions of dollars. They include reparative programs for coal miners suffering black lung disease, farmers whose crops have failed, workers whose companies have gone bankrupt, victims of terror and victims of natural disasters, people exposed to radiation from nuclear testing, military veterans, individual harms by pesticides, toxins, vaccines, oil spills, medical devices, workers and businesses affected by U.S. trade agreements, depositors in failed banks, cash payments during the COVID shutdown. We pay for societal debts that the nation incurs now or years, decades, or even more than a century ago. For example, a 2013 analysis of federal records revealed that the government was still making monthly payments to relatives of Civil War veterans. Opponents argue that it's unfair to single out Black people for repair when others have also suffered. This is the what about argument. Given the atrocities committed against other people of color, including the genocide of indigenous people, this is a reasonable question. While AB 3121 required the task force to focus solely on the legacies of centuries of slavery and anti-Black animus, the simple answer to what about is that all state-sanctioned harms should be acknowledged and repaired. And if it can't be done at the same time, then it should be done serially and in due course. History has shown that justice achieved by one group can set the precedent providing justice to all groups, as in a rising tide lifts all boats. As Americans, we recognize this. We don't usually say that no repair should be made to ameliorate the harm to any one group, unless we also provide repairs at the same time to all harm groups. States that suffer devastating wildfires like California don't say until we are fully restored, there should be no funds for states experiencing devastating hurricanes. Most people understand that just because it may not be possible to repair all harms for all groups all at once, it should not stop us from doing the repairs that we can. It should not be an excuse to do nothing. Therefore, with respect to reparations provided to Japanese Americans, to descendants of the Rosewood Massacre, to 9/11 victims, government did not interpose a condition that reparations should only be provided if it was at the same time provided to all groups. I think I sort of skipped a few slides, but thank you. So next, we're going to look at the Wall Street Journal's opinion, which illustrates the 5 opposition narratives. I'll quickly read the gist. Bad ideas never die. They go to California. And the latest is reparations for slavery. The Judiciary Committee voted to create a Freedmen's Affairs agency to implement recommendations from the state task force. It would establish an office to determine who would be eligible for a reparations windfall. The same committee cleared 2 other reparations bills, part of a package of 14. One bill would compensate African Americans for land taken for racially motivated reasons. The other would set aside 6% of state budget reserves to fund reparations. This comes on the heels of the task force report calling for a payment of $1.2 million for each adult. Estimates reckon the cost to taxpayers would be $800 billion. California's entire annual budget is $300 billion. Last year, San Francisco's committee on reparations submitted a plan to the city to pay $5 million each. There are problems of fairness. The court has barred programs that allocate benefits by race. But why should a Chinese American whose great-great-grandparents were discriminated against by the Chinese Exclusion Act have to pay for what slavery did to Black Americans? What about descendants of those who gave their lives in the Civil War to end the slave system? California wasn't even a slave state. Some say reparations won't pass. Last year, Governor Newsom said he regarded reparations as much more than cash payments. In California, ideas once thought impossible have a way of becoming inevitable. Think free health insurance for millions of illegal migrants. Once the genealogy office identifies beneficiaries, they will become a political constituency that will lobby for this vast wealth redistribution. Californians oppose reparations by more than 2 to 1, and not because they're indifferent to the stain of slavery. Taking cash from one group of Americans who had nothing to do with slavery and giving it to the descendants of those who suffered from it would add one injustice onto another. So let's go back through this editorial and dissect its messaging. Look at the rhetorical framing here. The first sentence begins with a ridicule. Bad ideas never die, which serves as a springboard for the central premise of the opinion, defining reparations as being exclusively about slavery. In other words, the "it's too late" narrative. And right out of the gate, this is followed by defining reparations as a windfall for the undeserving, the "it's unwarranted" argument. By omitting the nation's history of land confiscation, by omitting any mention of the enormous profits that have been reaped by state-sanctioned exploitation and exclusion of Black people, the Wall Street Journal paints a picture that compensation for land seizures is unwarranted and that budget set-asides to fund reparations are too much. Having defined reparations as being only about slavery of the past and therefore unwarranted, the opinion mischaracterizes reparations as only individual compensation, claiming that the task force called for the state to pay $1.2 million each, which is essentially the too much argument. Well, we never made a recommendation that the state pay $1.2 million. But putting aside this false statement, look what is really going on here. By coupling its unwarranted narrative that reparations is welfare for the undeserving, and coupling that figure with the figure of $800 billion, it becomes a powerful emotional trigger. The "it's unwarranted" and "it's too much" narratives are followed by the "what about" argument. This paragraph opens with a question about fairness and then deploys the Asian American model minority myth to bolster the argument that Black reparations are unwarranted. The opinion asks, why should a Chinese American whose great-great-grandparents were discriminated against have to pay for what slavery did to Black Americans? Remarkably, in a single sentence, the opinion pits Asian Americans against Black Americans and amalgamates the "it's not my fault" claim with the "what about" narrative that Black people should not be given reparations when Chinese Americans have suffered too. For good measure, the opinion throws in, and California wasn't even a slave state, a species of the "it's unwarranted" argument. In addition to the "what about" argument that Chinese Americans have also suffered, the op-ed also asks, what about descendants of those who gave their lives during the Civil War so that Black Americans could be free, implying that white Union soldiers died for Black people? I guess it didn't matter to the editors that Black people also fought in the Civil War and in every war that this nation has faced since its founding, giving their lives for the nation. Note the trigger words that the opinion mobilizes in characterizing reparations. Think free health insurance for millions of illegal migrants, which conflates the nation's border issues with Americans who have been lawfully here for centuries. Furthermore, this passage defines reparations as, quote, a vast wealth redistribution and not repairs for state-sanctioned harms or repayment of a debt owed. On the subject of vast wealth redistributions, what about the vast wealth redistribution of the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave nearly 4 million white Americans across 30 states vast amounts of federal land taken from Native Americans? What about the fact that between 1934 and 1962, the federal government issued $120 billion in cheap federally insured loans, 98% of which went to white borrowers? What about the huge wealth transfer arising from 2.5 centuries of free labor produced by enslaved people? The opinion circles back to where it began, closing with the "it's not my fault" narrative. Why should Americans having nothing to do with slavery have to pay for those who didn't suffer from it? Harkening back to some of the slides we just covered, these are societal deaths. They are not individual harms against other individuals. These are state-sanctioned harms. This argument in this slide from the Wall Street Journal combines the "it's too late" narrative that reparations is about slavery with the "it's unwarranted" narrative that reparations is a handout to the undeserving. So if you only remember one slide from this presentation, let it be this one. The history of racial exclusion is depicted as an arc of about 4 centuries, graphically showing that Black Americans as a people were longer enslaved than they have been free. Even this image is misleading in that it suggests in 1954, when the Supreme Court outlawed segregated schools in Brown versus Board of Education, it ended segregation. Well, far from it. Fierce resistance to the struggle for equal rights occurred all over the nation and continues to reverberate today. Well, I'm going to close here. I'm sorry that of my inexpertise in screen sharing, we missed a couple slides there, but I think we can sort of rescue that in the discussion to follow. So I'll turn it back to Michael to lead this.
Thanks, Don. Very appreciative of, wow, what a sweeping look at the sort of enduring impact of Black enslavement and taking us, in fact, all the way to the present, and sort of laying out what are the sort of dominant themes, the narratives, the ways in which critics of Black reparations have framed their opposition to it. I'm a little curious. I just want to start out with a question with you too. You do mention, in fact, that there were 115 recommendations that were put forth by the California Black Reparations Task Force. And I'm wondering if you could just touch on one or two to sort of take us away from a discussion of fixation, really, on sort of individual personal compensation to some of the ways in which we might explore other forms of repair and healing and try to address some of the kinds of persistent disparities we see with respect to healthcare, with respect to health, with respect to education, with respect to incarceration rates, with housing, everything. What are sort of one or two of those things that you might be able to briefly discuss?
Yeah, so 1,100 pages, there's a 100-page executive summary, but still a lot. And in the chat, I think Max is going to put in the links that you can access the report for free. It is heavily footnoted. It includes the research over the last 5 years. And basically, in your words, Michael, it traces a through line from the harm of enslavement right up to current day. I mean, what has been the impact? And the report itself, at least the history portion, is broken down into 13 chapters. It begins with slavery. And I have to say that I thought I knew something about American and California history. I think every member of the task force considered themselves very well read. But after going through this intense 2-year deep dive into long buried truths and history that is simply erased, and it now is in the last 5 years or so being unearthed, we all learned something. And for example, Reggie Jones Sawyer, one of the task force members, his uncle was one of the Little Rock Nine, that defied the Central Rock, Arkansas school board, 200 National Guard troops and the governor and a mob threatening to kill them just for enrolling in school. He had said, he thought that things that he found out about in California only occurred in the South. And so with that sort of perspective, this 13 chapters rolled out with enslavement. The next chapter was racial terror in terms of how the social order was enforced. The next chapter after that is political disenfranchisement, the legal, constitutional, cultural norms that held this society together along racial lines. And then it moves into segregation. So once you can segregate and dictate where people live and deprive resources and opportunities, then everything else flows, whether it's healthcare, policing, education, opportunities, labor, the arts, recreation, culture, everything. And so it really rolled out in those 13 chapters. And then each chapter has recommendations for each in terms of how we prepare this. And for example, because of the history of redlining and segregation in schools in Berkeley, in Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, there are huge disparities. The state sort of has remedied some of them with changing the funding formula. But there are recommendations, for example, in our report, which talk about funding additional monies to formally redline neighborhoods. That terminology is basically to base it on not a race-based remedy, but an occurrence-based remedy to get around, the more recent challenges to these racial-based remedies. Healthcare, for instance, huge disparities that reflect themselves in shortened lives. Well, the data shows that Black patients do better with Black medical providers. There's a communication and cultural thing going on. So the recommendations have to do with how to increase the pipeline of students, not only in undergraduate institutions like Berkeley, but in graduate schools leading to healthcare careers and creating pathways. Similarly, for career technical education, high-paying jobs in the tech industry, in programming and security and this sort of thing. There are recommendations about policing that are data-based and data which seeks to account for this huge disparity in disproportionate disparity in not only prosecution but in imprisonment. So, of course, I could do a whole webinar on just the recommendations. But if members have the curiosity, take 10 minutes just to sort of click on the report and sort of scan it here and there. Too much to read. I realize the strength of the report is so comprehensive. The weakness of the report is it's hard to read 1,100 pages. But you get some idea, and there's a whole section on of the 115 recommendations.
Right. Thank you, Don. And also, yes, you can go to the chat feature and see that both the executive summary and the complete 1,100-page final report, the links to them. I'm going to turn to Adriana, who's a graduate student here, is asked, like, for graduate students interested in centering reparations in our work, do you have a recommendation on what we should read or where we should be in our writing or publishing efforts? How do we add this to their ongoing studies and efforts?
A great resource is the final report because it distills some of the latest scholarship. From Here to Equality, William Darity, Kirsten Mullen has become a seminal book and triggering sort of a look into reparations, as well as the famous Ta-Nehisi Coates Atlantic article on reparations. So the scholarship is now getting out there. I have to say that as far as popular knowledge, the Tulsa Massacre, which occurred, in 1920, 21, 300 people massacred, an entire community burned to the ground. We're learning about that stuff now. This is over 100 years later. And so there's so much buried truth there that is being unearthed. But a good place to start is the report. It's highly footnoted, and you can scan it. And you could, choose the chapters on education, on the legal system, or labor, and you can get access to the footnoted stuff, which is cited, which will give you, clues to other source materials.
Good. Several people, Brian, Linda, have asked about the specific pieces of legislation that are now on the governor's desk. And so what are some of the content of those bills which are pending approval, and what can people do to help secure the success of those bills?
Well, there are 14 bills that were introduced by the California Legislative Black Caucus. There were a couple of introduced by individual Black legislators. Some of them never made it through the legislative process. They were dead. One was the creation of the Freedmen's Affairs Agency, which was cited in the Wall Street Journal article that I read to you. The other was the set aside of 6% of budget reserves for reparations. But other things did make it through the legislative process, including an appropriation in the budget of $12 million unallocated, just to be there for what the legislature would deem, repairs. And this is a paltry amount in comparison, obviously, to the harm, but it's not an insignificant amount either. In a budget year in which the state is looking down the barrel of a $46 billion deficit. There are legislation calling for supporting career technical education, enforcing discrimination against Black hairstyles, and the Crown extension of the Crown Act on this has to do mainly with, I would think, school discipline also related. There's an apology bill that has been proposed in which it would be embedded in state codes and be memorialized. The state also, during this task force process, committed to turning the final report into high school curriculum. And two UC Berkeley School of Education professors were hired to begin that process. And so there are others, but I would think the other thing is we're already working towards the 2025 legislative year in which making recommendations to the legislature as to what we think might be, doable and also effective beginning this process of repair. And the Legislative Black Caucus has made a commitment to raise this year after year. So it's incremental progress. It's not sweeping. Everybody should get used to the idea that there is not going to be one and done, like one legislative year and we're going to have reparations. It's not going to work like that. And I think the process will be, we have to take the long view. Outside of the state of California, I might add that other states are looking at us. So New York and Illinois have implemented similar reparations task forces. They haven't gotten as far as we have. And there are other cities and counties that are at least trying to unpack their own, buried history. So the process is just beginning, and a couple things that people might look at is if you can Google Alliance for, which stands for the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth. There's a listing of the bills that are on the governor's desk, and also what the process will be that ART is going to pursue going forward, which is twofold. One is policy, which is going to focus on converting the 115 bills into 115 recommendations into bills, and the other is how to normalize reparations and get it out to the American public that it's more than certainly cash payments and all of those arguments that we just went over.
Thanks so much, Don. We're sort of running out of our time, and thank you so much for that engaging presentation, and hopefully we'll spur folks to both look at the report and to think about how we might move forward in pushing for support for these reforms. I'm going to turn things back over to Susan, who's going to close.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and Don, thank you very much. I know this has been 2 years of your life and that you are continuing on with this work and the advocacy. I love the approach you've taken around sort of dissecting the arguments. It very helpfully underscores how much conversation we need to be having and working on this, all of us. And so I think you've given us the tools. There has been in the chat, as Michael has mentioned, a link to the report, a link to the legislation, to the Alliance, so that there is a way that people can stay informed. Thank you. Next week, when we have our speaker series on Friday morning, we will be in conversation with media legend Lowell Bergman. And Lowell will be talking about the concern that has brought him out of retirement, and which he is spending full time on, which is his concern about the unregulated, infinite reach of the media landscape. Big tech, as in Google and Apple, and the fear around how this will only increase civil unrest. So I hope that all of you will also join us for that conversation and others. And please share today's talk with your family, your friends, your colleagues. It will be available to you in your email this next week, and it will be on Ollie's YouTube site. So again, thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Michael. And I feel what a productive hour.
Thank you.
Thank you.